not run over it.
So welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and today Eve Lorgen is back, and we will talk about psychological impacts of strange encounters. And strange encounters can happen multiple ways.
Yeah, it's just, there's so much that sometimes I don't know where to begin. But we actually did an email where, like, what we want to talk about next, because there's always like new things that arise or deeper insights or things that are with current things that are going on. What are the issues coming up now? And so I had a whole list. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't realize I had so much to say. And it might have sounded like a complaint of things that come up in a therapist's life. I consider myself a therapist for anomalous trauma. And it's always therapy and recovery first, and then research second, if that comes up. So in the beginning, I probably started with a little bit more research to bring out what I felt was important when I was discovering things in the alien encounter, visitation, military, all that stuff in the old days. And then as I learned more, I realized, wait a minute, I need to focus on this in order to get deeper insights and freedom from the issues that come, which are unpleasant. Okay, or they're deviated. It's like the cult groups. So that means therapy and safety first, and then what you discover from the truth of that process, which is an empowering process. And then from there, we can go into how we understand things differently and even research. Hold on, I got a cough. Okay.
Okay. So what I wanted to ask you, I have always asked myself when we hear about people that end up in different projects like MK Ultra or what's the other one? Mm, it will come to me. What is the role of the parents? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
usually if I were a parent, even if I made the decision to send my kid to a boarding school, I would visit that school. I would put it under a microscope. I would send my spies out to
Yeah.
evaluate what is really going on there and so on and so forth. So that always puzzled me. How do people end up in these projects, and do the parents know? Do they play a role? Do you have any insights?
Yeah. Um, I first learned about this actually early in my when I went to school for my master's degree in counseling psychology. I actually met a woman who claimed that she was from a satanic ritual abuse family. And I don't know if she used that term, but it was definitely ritual abuse with a CIA connected family where her and her sister were used as assets for the CIA and the cult, and that they were both, in those days, they called it multiple personality disorder. So they were both MPD with altered personalities created through the specific ritual abuse and whatever MK Ultra that is may be added on top of that. So in their case, she was from a family system, which is like a satanic Illuminati bloodline, probably full bloodline, where their parents are in full collusion with putting their children in the program and training in the cult. So in those cases, the parents collude consciously to keep their kids in the training of ritual abuse or MK Ultra, or give them over to different agencies to use when they are bloodline usually, but sometimes they are not what fully conscious bloodline parents. And so there might be one who's like a Freemason or a Freemason grandfather, and then maybe one of the parents is they've been narcissistically abused, and they're just not really with it in terms of they're not healed, but they're not active cult members, but their spiritual authority from the Freemason in their family line somehow laid claim to the downline, and then they end up getting abducted or taken in a project. So I see a lot of that actually in the I'm calling the people who discovered that they had military abductions in some kind of way that's connected to an alien abduction history. But their parents didn't seem to be involved. They might have been a little bit dysfunctional, but they weren't off running off to friggin' rituals and wearing robes and doing blood sacrifice.
Mm,
So in some of those cases, I believe there's a spiritual authority that takes place that they're able to go direct access to the child. Sometimes it's a grandparent, sometimes it's the aliens directly, or a cult member that's not a family member, but that's still connected. So, but some parents do give over their child to be used. And so I knew someone whose mom was a Santeria practitioner in Mexico,
mm,
where she couldn't afford to live, wanted to come to the United States. So, in exchange, well, just offer over your child to be in this project, or just offer them over to us. And I don't think they gave her details about what that would mean. She just wanted to come to the US or make some kind of bargain. And so that person ended up being used in a milab and alien abduction project that worked together. And so sometimes it's a Santeria thing, sometimes it's a Freemason thing, sometimes it is a direct, satanic Illuminati bloodline, what they call the full bloodline people. A lot of times the parents are aware and they deliberately train their children in these trauma-based trainings. And so the people you were here talking about, that would be people like some of the originals whistleblowers were people like Kathy O'Brien,
mm,
Susan Ford, Arizona Wilder, Fritz Spingmeyer, Cisco Wheeler, and then Jessie Zaboter is a recent one who's really going into a lot of detail and clarity on what she's calling the hierarchy system elite families, and what they do to train their own to be used as assets for the system and the cult. So that could include, the blood sacrifice, the ritual abuse, the trauma, to train them and actually assess how they assess a child for how they're going to use them productively for the quote cult or the system. So one of the things that she brought up that I thought was really very revealing, because I'm learning this too, but I've learned things from the alien abduction end and the MyLab end, or people say they were in the Montauk Project or they're in the secret space program, but oftentimes they don't seem to have a clear recall or family connection to, like, oh, I'm an Illuminati bloodline person and my parents sold me over to the CIA or whatever. They're like, I don't know, they just took me since I was a kid and they just started testing me, and all of a sudden, I'm in these projects, and then when I was in the military, they did more, but they don't know, there's not a clear connection. So I believe oftentimes there actually is, but they don't remember it, or they don't understand the connections and authorities laying claim and accessing certain people for certain reasons. So to get back to Jessie Zaboter, who's a survivor and has done several public affidavits of witness testimony of, high-level people involved in these quote rituals. She talked about the gateway experience. And so I think it's connected to what is known with the Monroe Institute Gateway Program, where doing different brainwave hemisync headphone things to get the brain in a, let's say, a alpha, a theta, a delta state, and then doing certain exercises to imagine going to different dimensions, remote viewing, astral projection, accessing spiritual dimensions, or maybe supernatural abilities that's being trained through this experience. So, a lot of what many of the MyLab people have gone through to prep them, and these are the later generations where it became more available, like in the, let's say, in the elementary school age, maybe, or high school, where they went through a gateway experience that helped prep them and train them to be used as an asset with certain abilities. And then they were somehow in a program where they don't remember, and then it might be a secret space program where they think they were taken for a period of time, and then they were age regressed back to another time in their physical life, and then they end up having like looped memories at some point in their life that tells them they were used for a number of years based on early training that they remembered from, let's say, an elementary school, and they may not remember what happened before that. So basically, people are just coming in with what they remember, but as time goes on in their life, and if they do their trauma recovery, then they find out what's really the most important thing to go for the truth. It's not necessarily bells and whistles of giving your testimony before you have full recovery and doing a popular YouTube channel or selling your, Merkaba meditation, blah, 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 or channeled this or astrological charts or Akashic record. It's endless what these people are doing, and they're bypassing the recovery process, which would probably give them more evidence of how did this come to be. They didn't just pluck you from a school because you tested for a hearing test. A lot of times it's a hearing test where you can hear maybe more frequencies that others don't hear. And then you might test for higher intelligence. Usually it's higher intelligence, psychic ability, dissociation ability, and then sometimes like a physical ability, like a super athlete or a scientist, or you have like a entertainment, singing, whatever. They'll want people who show a propensity for these gifts. So they test you early in life, like how Jesse Zaboter talks about, so that they can test the children early on when you're like between 4 and 6 or 3 and like really young, and then they will do a series of actually traumas that if someone dissociates, they will do a dissociation and not remember and create an alter personality for that trauma. And so they could dissociate into the spirit realm, but they left their body or they dissociated. That means, okay, we tested them and they tested positive for dissociation. So we want to use them as somebody who can dissociate. And then they may test for many different things, or if they have a psychic ability or whatever. So that tells you, they do this really early on to basically set the foundation of, okay, well, we know this one dissociates, so we're going to take them later for a project so that we can use them so that they won't remember how they're being used because they've already created the alter personalities. So it
Mm-hmm.
gets complex because I think most people who don't have a understanding of psychology, trauma, MK Ultra, they don't understand how this is happening or happened to them at a very young age because that's still an amnesia. So, which is why I think there's a propensity towards the bells and whistles entertainment quality of the secret space program or the disclosure movement or the alien abduction or whatever it is. Because if you get to the down and dirty of what happened to these kids, let's say before they were tested in elementary school, okay, or before the military took them for their SSP 20-year whatever, more often than not, when they were really, really young, if they were taken by aliens, and they usually have had all the sirens are going off in the neighborhood now. I mean, you can hear them like going. I don't know if you hear it. I'm waiting for it to stop. Go figure.
Can't hear it.
I know. I'm like, why the sirens? Like many, many sirens going back and forth on the street. And I live on a busy street. So anyway, what I'm finding is that, okay, early in life, definitely by age 3, between 3 and 6 is when the most significant trauma-based mind control programming must be set in place to lay the foundation for them to be used later in projects or as an asset. So these things happen early in life, sometimes even before that. And you're talking about infancy in the womb, conception ritual or dedication rituals before they're even born with rituals. So this is the spiritual authorities that the cults use to get these people prepped before they even end up in a project. So these are the things that people don't realize and don't remember. So to get back to the point I wanted to make, and this is what I'm finding, people, many in what they're calling now secret space program. Before we just called it, well, there's a milab element. There's an element of abductions that is clearly alien, and then there's an element of human military or medical that seem to be in collusion with certain alien groups that are working in these underground bases or other locations on military bases. So they know there's a collusion. So there's both. So but maybe in the old days we didn't know there was a 20 and back SSP, but now it's the popular thing. Oh, it's a secret space program or a special, unacknowledged special access program. That's one of the terms they're using. But really, what's happening in their histories before the military even gets involved in some human thing, the aliens already got them and prepped them and took them, I say, from infancy, definitely from early on, like 3 to 6, because the aliens are prepping them for trauma split and whatever tests and things that they need to do, which goes
Mm.
back to what was learned with Dr. Corrado Malanga's work, as well as my own, and Dr. Carla Turner and Barbara Bartholick. There's things that go on much earlier than what people are remembering as their first abduction experience. Well, of course, a lot of times you don't remember if it happened before age 3 or before age 6, and if there was a trauma split that occurred deliberately, because they're doing it to prep and set the foundation to use these people as assets. So the issue is, what I'm seeing is a tendency towards what I'm calling a Stockholm syndrome situation, which sometimes it's a human propensity against feeling the discomfort of what is the underlying conflict of deeper trauma that is earlier in your lifetime, such as attachment trauma, birth trauma, or if rituals were done to dedicate you in the womb, before the womb, at birth, then you're talking about other uncomfortable things that, if those spiritual forces are laying claim, they're going to be working against that person's awareness to recover the truth. And so this is where a spiritual approach and a trauma recovery approach have to be taken into consideration. And that is where I think a lot of people, they just don't know, and they won't go there, and they will resist that which causes pain or fear. So they go for the bypass. Okay. And so the bypass is the bells and whistles of the entertainment aspect of it, or let's just turn it into a research project and go on this mental external knowledge kind of acquisition of information, and have your YouTube channel and you're a researcher, and behind all that is a bunch of trauma that hasn't been dealt with. Okay. And we see this in the truther movement and what I'm called the controlled opposition, which is deliberately created that way because the trauma wasn't dealt with. So we always have to ask the question, why is so much focus on this particular external access information and knowledge when this person isn't demonstrating in their life and in their being a kind of balanced life of, like, you dealt with your stuff, or you're working on it, or what it is. Okay. So I see this all the time. Bypass, bypass, bypass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So, in other words, everything that they are telling us, what is woo-woo and fringe, there are assorted agencies who are actively pursuing it and doing their research. And the public is being told all of that is nonsense.
Being told that the research is
There,
nonsense, or
there is no clairvoyance. There are
oh,
no, nobody is visiting different dimensions, and the, all of that. It's practically the official stance is it's all woo-woo. And but on the other hand, as you just said, CIA and other agencies, they are actively pursuing it.
oh yeah. Well, I mean, I'll just do another quote because I heard Jesse Zaboter say it on a show with was the Africa Rising. They do a lot of good shows, but I was interested in the Gateway Experience simply because that was one of the primary things done with a lot of the secret space program training that's done later enough in life to remember it. So, but what did she say is that because she's from a bloodline family, which means high level Illuminati family, but doesn't mean that they necessarily have money either. But because of her family line and both parental involvement and grandparents for sure. So when she started remembering things and the discomfort of, trauma, she happened to actually be someone who wasn't as dissociated as many of these survivors are actually. which actually is a benefit to her power in being able to recover. But basically, one of the stats she gave, which is just a ballpark, is that in her, probably by the time she was still maybe in her 20s or maybe younger, finding out these things and wanting to tell someone and wanting to do something about it, like, oh, I'm kind of remembering these bad things, and there's like these people in my family and community are like murdering babies and shit, and like they want to talk to somebody and do the right thing and tell the appropriate authorities you think would be listen and want to do the right thing, right? And 7 out of 10 people in the community, in her community, are basically in the system. So they're not going to help. They're going to promote the system, promote the denial, promote the gaslighting, and make the person who's reporting it wrong and bad and crazy. So among the people who helped were maybe the few people who would be willing to listen and to pray for her, who were maybe in a church or maybe other survivors that were awake. But basically, you're dealing with a lot of, you're realizing that in the system, this happened even in my own family when I was growing up, where we wanted to get help. And then the social worker that was assigned to my family and my sister, who was a runaway, right? In those days, they had to be assigned a social worker because of the problems. Because once it's on the record, the family's assigned a social worker. Well, the social worker was a friggin' pedophile who was an unrecovered alcoholic who was like trying to like molest my sister. So it was like, oh, and so when she tried to tell the truth, you couldn't get someone to help. And then my dad was involved with the Freemasons, who had all his Freemason buddies who were involved with people in the community who kept the secrets for him. So you're dealing with how safe is it to tell my truth? And how many people were really involved in the system, or they just don't know what's going on, so that the effect of telling the truth might be a major gaslight, a major rejection. And it hurts really bad to be rejected over and over again when you're hurting and you really have a true need. And so is that's something that comes up with a lot of the milabs, abductees, and especially people who ritual abuse survivors. If there's any one group that gets the ultimate rejection and fear, or the alien abductees for sure, and the ritual abuse people. And I found that to be true. Like once you mention that word, man, the people turn on you in a dime. And it's unfortunate, but I have run into this myself where there's so much fear around, oh my God, spooky Satanist ritual abuse. There's no such thing, where there's no such thing as aliens, and there's people who are actually mind controlled, unrecovered, who are being used to gaslight and badmouth other people who are coming forward. So sometimes you'd think, oh, well, I'm going to tell my truth. And there's these other survivors. I know they've had experiences too. They said they're in the secret space program and they've had a thing. And they're like the one who's gaslighting you and acting like they're in a cult run by Stockholm syndrome to basically oust you so that nobody wants to talk to you and you're all bad mouth. They're all bad mouthing against you. It's like this, gossip thing. So it's like for survivors to get help. In hindsight, I would say you have to go to safe people who understand and tread carefully on and just observe, like, you have to test the waters. Is it safe to talk about this? But when you start talking about that, well, that's a buzzword for instant rejection. So it might be, let's just say what I've found in my own life. I sometimes you think, oh, well, I can talk to this person or join this little group or whatever. And you come to find out that they were more harmful. And then the ones who were like generous and kind and accepted you and wanted to be your friend were like people who weren't even related to those groups. And you may not even have shared that kind of belief system, but they were like the kind, generous ones who's like helped you for years.
Mm.
So you never really know. And then, so I'm learning this as I go along. There's a lot of, it still is the bypassing thing. But to go forward on that, like what is spiritual bypassing or even mental bypassing of, let's say, a deep issue that's related to trauma or relationship stuff? There are systems of belief which encourage a narrative that actually does a kind of blame the victim thing. so that you actually can't get the real help you need to truly recover. And so sometimes they're within certain spiritual faiths or religions, or outright religions, or outright scientific beliefs or psychological beliefs that actually encourage the narrative, which in hindsight, when I look at what needs to happen for us to recover so that we can be safe, we can be relaxed, we can get what we need, we could feel loved and accepted enough to just kind of relax in our inner truth so it reveals itself. That means we don't have to find truth from everybody else. We have to be in a place where enough love and safety and coherent connection happens so that emergence happens naturally. So that naturalness of deep connection in loving kindness and safety and understanding is actually what's lacking, even in some traditional therapeutic assumptions of what needs to happen for trauma recovery. So that's what I'm running across lately with people talking to me, like in hindsight, after all these years where they were involved in sometimes it was in a, they were a nun or they were in a spiritual group of advanced meditation practices or Advaita Vedanta or non-dualism or, trauma recovery from only a particular perspective. But the shits kept happening and there wasn't a real recovery and they still couldn't get past what these repeat patterns were. And so it just tells you that there's some bypasses going on with narratives, which are still, they're still kind of promoting a blame the victim, that what you're experiencing is not real. And if we just focus on something else, it'll all go away, you know?
Have you ever come across one individual where parents really didn't have a clue? They had no idea what was going on with their child, that they didn't understand the nature of the project. Did that ever occur?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, or at least one parent didn't know, or they were, a lot of times it's they were dysfunctional, like they were an active alcoholic, they had unrecovered sexual abuse, narcissistic abuse, so they were unaware of their child's needs or unaware of like a lot of times there's alien abductions going on in a family and many of the family members were unaware. And what makes them unaware? A lot of times it's, well, they've had all this other stuff that if you have too much chaos and unrecovered trauma, even from like normal family stuff, you may not have the wherewithal to remember the alien abductions.
Mm.
So I don't know. I think with the advent of, at least since what they're calling the Eisenhower era of the agreements that were made with certain more malevolent alien groups, that where there was an increased rate of abductions of direct access of children by aliens or who's ever working with those groups, bypassing the parental knowledge or agreement that would have happened, let's say, in the old days before this technology went, is just going logarithmic. In the old days, which I've learned from ritual abuse survivors who are from high level families, this happened normally in the cult families who are, you can call it the serpent race families, who the gods that they were, worshiping or sacrificing to were the blood sacrifice ones that gave them power over the world or whatever. And they did this to their own kids, and they've been doing this for thousands of years. It's like ancient secrets. And so they held these secrets for many years, but they were usually within the family. And because they were within that family system, those spiritual oaths and authorities over generations was already given over. They were property. So all the people in that line are our property to access and direct access by these beings. But
Mm.
what we're finding now is because of the, I don't know where we are in the world, because of the governments or other groups who have made agreements, or even what do you call it, military industrial complex corporations that are even above governments, some governments, right? Because they're infiltrated, then their involvement has given an extra access for families to be basically used and abducted without the parental authority. And so I think there's parents who don't know, but there are parents who do. And then so a lot of times it's actually if the father is the head of the family according to the spiritual laws, let's say it's a Freemason who got to a certain level, and because he's the head of the family, well, his word is the authority of the family and the children. So maybe he didn't even have to tell the wife. She's just abused alcoholic who's narcissistic abused by this, you know, perp narcissist, whatever, who joined the Masons like my dad. So they didn't give authority, they didn't even know, but the authority is given somewhere, somehow. And I think this happens in, I think I heard this from someone else who was a, what do you call it, defense contracted, let's say aerospace, military industrial complex uh, employee. And then the things they have to sign with not only non-disclosure, but access of surveillance. And they basically give authority over to these corporations and the egregore of the corporation, which are run by high-level hierarchy system people. Okay, Satanists run the corporations.
Mm.
Okay, so once they make those signed agreements, they actually have authority over that family and the kids
Oh
to be
yeah.
used in a project or to be surveilled or accessed somehow. And it's like most people don't know the level of authority or property that we are. So that kind of goes into a lot of these other issues of sovereignty. And even the who was it, Charles Fort, in his early works, that hey, humanity, we are property here. Somehow we are property. Someone's laying claim to us and doing all these things, the straw man and all that. But there's much more, I think, going on since a particular era of time, since the whole World War II, or even,
Mm.
I don't know, whenever those agreements were made, it just amplified the authority and the direct access of people and projects now for human trafficking too. So I know
Mm.
that goes on. Maybe I'll stop there for a while.
Yeah. So when I prepared for this interview, I found out that there are actually some studies about anomalous trauma. But I have to say, I found one on PubMed, and it had a little bit this flavor. Yeah, well, the people are a little bit to blame for that themselves because they believe in aliens, in alien abduction, they believe in psychics. And so the entire setup, it felt like victim blaming.
Yes,
On
yes.
the other hand, I found one paper, and I will read it here. And he said health practitioners did not receive proper training in listening constructively to these experiences. This is problematic because every second person finds it difficult to integrate such experiences. And that was one of the papers where I thought, okay, that is somewhat balanced, and they do not get the blame victim canon out. And so I guess this, what he says here, listening, constructively listening, that is a key point here. But if how do people find a counselor that can do that?
Well, I mean, listening is good,
Mm.
definitely. Um, Certainly don't want someone to like give you, tell you what you should think and do. So I guess it depends on the client, because some people want to talk your ear off and they keep looping, um, and they don't, and there's not a constructive shift, but they need to be heard. I think people need to be heard where they could feel safe enough to just feel kind of accepted and understood. And then once that, it's almost like a rest takes place inside, that then you can kind of gently ask questions, and then things start emerging in their experience, which can give more details and deeper understandings of what is really happening or had happened. And so people need to definitely feel heard and understood. And I think they don't if, someone assumes that, oh, because they don't, in their reality, they don't believe that these things take place. Well, that's a major gaslight that's actually can cause you more harm. So I remember like even in my own life of like feeling like I needed to work on stuff, let's say from my divorce and from issues that were coming up as a result of that, which is like but more was happening. There was abductions, there was other stuff. But I knew that, okay, I can't find a therapist for free at the social service agency. So I had to go. And I worked with someone who did EMDR, which is a trauma release type of method with rapid eye movement. It's real simple, but what I did is like, I know, okay, I can't really tell the whole truth because I know their reality in a system. They're gonna make you crazy, right? They would misdiagnose. So when the stuff comes up, the trauma shit and the dreams of, I just can't talk about that. I just won't tell them. But I'll talk about the feelings, about, the husband and the normal stuff, and talk just about the feelings without having to go into detail about what really happened. Then I knew that I could at least do that. But it's almost like we have to make ourselves safe so that we're not going to be misdiagnosed and then they're going to really use it against us. And that's terrible when that happens. And you know, I feel bad for people when that happens, you know.
Yeah, yeah. So do you, for instance, I mean, not everybody lives in your neighborhood, but would you be able to counsel people via Zoom?
Oh yes, I do. I do actually.
Oh,
I do a lot.
okay. Mhm.
So it is through Zoom, and that works well for me because there's people all over the world who, sometimes people prefer that now. It's so much easier than traveling.
Mm,
But in person, there's always more to be gained. Like if you work, you know, hypnotically, you could look at the cues and the physiology and the breathing and I think the real presence of someone, it works better. And I noticed that with groups, like if you want to be together and pray and do a group prayer together, that helps when you're in person because so much is done, digitally and online now. It makes it, well, I guess there's a challenge and there's also a freedom with that. But yeah,
yeah, everything has its up and down sides, of course.
yeah.
So when, let's say, we pick something easy, like seeing an alien craft,
Mm.
what determines usually how the person reacts to it? Well, I personally could imagine, okay, if let's say it happens to somebody that absolutely rejects the idea of the possibility that there might be aliens and that they are already here and so on and so forth, that would be probably a great shock. I have never seen one, but I, yeah, I would be surprised, sure, but it wouldn't shock me to the core. So what else determines the reaction?
Yeah, I think when we're young, we may react differently than you would if you were older. It's like,
Mhm,
when you're older, I'm seeing a craft is kind of like no big deal unless it's very large and going slow and hanging out over your house or something. But that's usually it's night lights in the sky that are acting in anomalously, then there's a craft. But I think it's really the experiences that happen, in your bedroom at night, or if the beings appear at the end of the bed and you get paralyzed, or if you remember things being done medically or physically, that's a little bit more disturbing.
mhm.
Missing time. But I think some people are just, sometimes we don't have a worldview, to deal with that when you're really young. Like even when I was young, I think my first physical event that I could remember, I didn't even see a craft. What I saw was a large jet hovering over the backyard. So in my 4-year-old mind, I couldn't even conceive of that. So it saw a jet, but I'm sure it wasn't that. And I
Yeah,
wasn't ever,
jets do not hover.
no.
They are not capable of that. I know that.
Yeah. So I think too, like even in the abduction literature, where people were sometimes their car stopped, something happened, and then they see like a life-size owl or a cat or an animal with big black eyes, but it's really an entity. In fact, I remember I had an event when I was an adult, but there were beings that entered into the house through a portal, and I had a visitor. It was actually a, let's see, my son's cousin, who was only 12 years old at the time. And my son was younger than that. And I'm an adult, but it was the same event that happened in the house where there was a visitation by, I believe they could have been alien grays, but I perceived them differently. I saw them through my third eye as small beings, like almost just small beings. But the 12-year-old saw them as small little men with sunglasses and caps on. But they were really like alien grays with the big black eyes. But if you see it through that filter of perception, somebody else is going to see it. Oh, well, they're wearing sunglasses and caps. So they see how they have to see it. But the same night, the same thing happened with these visitors, but they appeared differently to two different observers. So that tells you I think we have our own filter of perception through our third eye when they're coming in like interdimensionally. So we may see it differently. And sometimes we see it as an animal or a different kind of figure.
Mhm.
That's popular though in the literature. You see that you might see it as an animal and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a full-on abduction, that is a whole different ball game than just seeing a craft. And but how how do we distinguish if we are really abducted by aliens or if that is a military operation?
That's a good question.
Are
Well, all
there
of it,
overlaps?
yes, sometimes they are, and I believe now. Well, I've seen this in, how can I say it? Let's just take the example of what happened in the Ted Rice case in the Masquerade of Angels book written by Dr. Carla Turner. By the way, Ted Rice is still alive and he's speaking on a show called Alien Talk with another man from Ireland named Stuart Eglinton. And so he's talking about newer things that he's remembered since the time of the book. And he had to go into hiding, by the way, after Dr. Carla Turner died or was, quote, murdered through an
Mm,
illness. Right? So I just found that out recently as I was on the show, but we talked about one of the things that happened that's written in the Masquerade of Angels, which is an outside observer's perspective of an abduction as it's happening that has a military component and an alien component. Okay. So in that particular experience, I know Ted and another woman, there's two women, they're sharing a bedroom in a out of town place where he's going for a workshop or whatever. And one of the women's gets abducted in this house and they're sharing a bedroom together. So the one woman who is not the abductee is observing the other woman's reaction to a blue beam of light that comes down through the ceiling and kind of like in a paralyzed state looking up. And I think she could still move her eyes and kind of scream and talk. But from the woman who's nearly paralyzed with the blue light coming down from the ceiling, like through the ceiling, she's seeing aliens appear, if I remember correctly, at the foot of her bed in the presence in the room. And she's also hearing helicopters overhead, which is like a military thing, right? Military. Oh, there's military with a helicopter ahead. And definitely hearing it and definitely seeing these beings appear and then like talking to them, having this experience. With the outside observer just sees the blue beam of light coming down in the semi-paralyzed state of the woman trying to basically tell of her experience and break out of the paralysis. So they both observed the same thing. All they saw was the blue light coming through the ceiling. But the experience of the woman was, the full on helicopters and seeing these beings interact and some kind of experience that suggested the milabby thing. So I think they can affect our perception via technology, but it doesn't mean that they're not there doing something. So that's one example of an outside observer seeing what's happening to someone else's experience, who's experiencing it differently because their perceptions are being overridden by a type of technology. So I think that they can do that in abductions, and they could make you perceive, well, they're shapeshifters, right? So a lot of these beings could shapeshift into a medical personnel. They could make them look like a human. It's really a reptilian. And there's all kinds of little things that they can do to make you see something else. So it depends on who's taking you. But what I've seen too is some people who have a history of trauma where we're discovering that it is based on MK Ultra and ritual abuse as the foundation that created the MK Ultra later through a family system with a secret society, high level ranking occult uh, member, a family member, like a father, and then others. And so in the memory of trauma, it's something that it comes up as very symbolic and kind of morphs around, but there's symbols that show a ritual took place where there was a deliberate theatrical act in ritual done to program them and traumatize them to have a particular reaction and dissociation and being controlled by the ritual of beings that were acting in and through these abusers that were human in theatrical robes and doing the ritual. Okay, so this actually I've learned through others where sometimes in the family system, whose hierarchy system Satanists or whatever, they have access to theaters, so they could rent a theater or a basement or a room in a house, and they have access to robes and theatrical setups. So they could set up being dressed up like a mean monster or do something that scares the child who's only what, a 3-year-old or whatever. And those are, they think they're seeing a devil or they think they're seeing an alien, or and then they may do a ritual sacrifice where they actually do kill a baby and then bury the baby. And it's like someone who would do neurolinguistic programming in symbolic ways that a child would get programmed by, because they have to do it in symbolic ways because they don't necessarily know language real well. But when I see what they're remembering, I see this was a ritual abuse event that took place, but they were so dissociated from it, it still seems like this nebulous kind of weird thing that they're like imagining, but they're not. It's because they dissociated, and it was an event that really did occur in the physical by theatrical road people who still had these malevolent entities and demons working through them, that her spirit saw the entities. So they have spiritual perception of the overlay of the demons and entities working in and around the humans who are doing this ritual event in robes and theatrical costume. Okay. And so that actually happens. So they can fake things. Or what I think is happening now with the ability to have technology, just like the blue light and the blue beam and the helicopter sound, I think they already have craft that have abilities like UFOs or whatever, and they could actually do a direct access abduction to someone with humans who are working with aliens that they've already made agreements with. To go and abduct these kids and make it look like an alien abduction because the aliens really were there with them. And I know people who were in secret projects who were adults, and they were like a super soldier in one of these programs back in the old days, even, who were used to help abduct people in craft with humans and aliens, taking people, and they helped in abductions. And then they helped them with their screen memories to like, which screen memory do you want to cover up this event? And they like gave them their choice. Okay. So this actually happens too, where there's human collusion, but some of them who are colluding, let's say in milabs, where they didn't give their permission to be used in a project, but they just ended up being used as an asset to help abduct other people or help abuse other people. And this happens in MK Ultra, or happens in some who are abducted, or part of their job as a, oh, they're working with the aliens. Well, they're helping the aliens abduct people. and they're helping them fly the craft, and they're helping them calm down other abductees who are being abducted where medical things are going on. So we're finding those things out too. So there's definitely both things happening, and it's not a one or the other. So people want to think, oh, it's one or the other, it just doesn't exist at all because, they want to feel like they're in power and control of their reality because it hurts more to think, if I'm not in control here, that doesn't feel very good. Or if reality really isn't what they've been told, and that's pretty scary. So that you can't go there. So people just can't go there, and we see that in society. I mean, how much do we see that, right?
Yeah. And so, in other words, it's probably a cooperation between military and ETs.
Mhm. Or
So,
human and or humans and non-human gods, false gods, entities who may use many different forms and who can shapeshift into many different forms. And because they're the false gods who gave the people power, you can be our royalty, you can help us rule the world. And so it's like the old fashioned, Pharaoh and their royalty bloodlines running the whole show and the whole farm. But they gotta do your blood sacrifice. You gotta give us a few. And as long as you give us what we want, we'll give you the power and you take care of the farm for us. But if they don't get their sacrifices, get that loose feed, get those blood sacrifices, well, they might just burn out of town. Or they might just, make your farm, take away the weather or like a famine, you didn't do what we wanted, so we're just going to like ruin your town and punish you for it or whatever, right? So I think there's a lot of that going on because there's no need for us to have to go through such punishment and torture to get spiritually enlightened. And this is another topic that has come up with survivors who realize that they've been in a spiritual bypass controlled narrative which deviated from what they really needed to become healed and truly spiritually aware with what I'm calling the original eternal awareness, which is loving and compassionate and more content and more different than what we're assuming. Let me just give you a quick example, then I'll pause. But remember, like in the old days, even in now, maybe like the old Catholic I don't even, it's before that, where they whip themselves. Oh, they're just gonna like whip themselves and they like have to go through all this torture and pain to get closer to God or to have to go through these, super ascetic mortification processes to become more enlightened. And the more pain you feel and the more you give of your whole self to be, and then is this a loose feed? So you have to ask the question that, like, why would they need you to torture yourself and to starve to death and to give all yourself up to a guru who's really a predator, who's loose feeding to become enlightened?
Mhm.
Or, so there's a lot of that going on actually. Yeah.
Yeah. When you say they test which children tend to disassociate, what is the disassociation needed?
Oh, good question. This is something that I learned early on, and I think Fritz Springmeier talked about this in there's like a big 3-volume series of how to create a total Illuminati mind-controlled slave, and a lot of it was monarch programming, but there's really actually many more projects underneath how trauma-based mind control is used. And they call that MK Ultra, but MK Ultra, I think, was just the military applications. And then many projects even under that, depending on how they might want to utilize someone. So the 3 qualities that they always looked for, and that this would be genetically honed to create, like if they could connect this bloodline and that bloodline and marry these families together and they have kids, we're going to make that so that they have, high intelligence and high psychic ability or some kind of supernatural gift. And then what else was it? Supernatural ability, intelligence, and the ability to dissociate. Because, see, dissociation causes one to dissociate from the trauma, which is what we call an irreconcilable emotional conflict, a moral conflict, or a severe threat to life itself. So it's three major kinds of conflicts that create like the overwhelm that causes you to basically split off from reality. So something else takes over, can function. And then that part that takes that irreconcilable emotion or whatever it is basically goes in the back, is actually stored in the back of your brain in a whole different place. And so that's the part. So if someone dissociates as a survival skill, they want that person because that means they could add in programming to the part that has dissociated so that whenever that same emotion comes up or a trigger that could be deliberate or non-deliberate, then that programming takes over when the alter personality. And it's hard to explain, but that actually is it's a survival instinct, which is good because it actually protects our core original self and the core pure spirit, because we don't want our spirit being accessed by dark powers, because that should be protected at all costs. So
This was the public hour. For full access of the entire interview, please join our Patreon community. Thank you.